On our newscast tonight, Typhoon Danas hits the nation packing a punch with wind gusts up to 45 meters per second and heavy downpours. Korea's southernmost island of Jeju bears the brunt of the damage. A joint naval drill between South Korea, the U.S. and Japan was scheduled to start today, but Typhoon Danas had other plans. Authorities are now deciding whether to simply postpone or cancel the joint exercise altogether. And this year's APEC summit comes to a close with leaders adopting a joint declaration and agreeing to extend their commitment to resist protectionist measures to 2016. An agreement in line with what President Park Geun-hye had been calling for. We have these stories and more, so stay with us.
It is 5 a.m. in Washington, 5 p.m. in Bali, and 6 on a Tuesday evening here in Seoul. Welcome to Early Edition at 6. I'm Moon Geon-young.
And I'm Daniel Chen. Thank you for joining us. A powerful typhoon is approaching Korea. That's why we start with the weather.
That is correct. We begin this evening with Korea's first tropical storm in October in 15 years. Now, earlier this afternoon, Typhoon Danas was about 110 kilometers southeast of Korea's Jeju Island.
The nation's southern and east coast regions are expected to get the worst of the storm, with heavy rain and strong winds coming later tonight.
Well, for details on where the storm is headed and how it's likely to affect the regions when it gets there, let's go over to our Kim Bo-kyung at the Weather Center for an update. Now, Bo-kyung, we're waiting for the impact of Typhoon Danas. What is the latest?
Well, the country is seeing direct and indirect influences of the typhoon, and the east coast and southern regions, including Jeju Island, are currently under a typhoon warning. And the southern regions are currently seeing lots of rain and heavy and strong winds. Let's take a look at the map for details on the typhoon's path. Well, as you can see, the typhoon was about 110 kilometers south of Jeju Island at 3 p.m. today, and it is expected to pass about 130 kilometers south of Busan by around 9 p.m. today before moving towards Dokdo and towards Japan. Now, it is the east coast and southern regions of the country that is expected to be the most affected by the typhoon. The typhoon is expected to bring about strong winds blowing at about 30 meters per second. This is enough to blow a tile, so please be on the watch. And in those regions, there should be over 200 millimeters of precipitation, so please have an umbrella with you and please make sure that your facilities are in place. Other than that, the rest of the nation should see an end to the rain by tomorrow morning or later tonight. Now, taking a closer look at tomorrow's forecast, Seoul and Gwangju will be both sunny with highs of 27 degrees. Meanwhile, it should rain until tomorrow morning in Daegu and Busan, hitting 26 degrees. Now, moving on to other regions, Daejeon and Jeju should both make it to the mid-20s, and Mount Kumgang tops out at 14. I'll be back with more updates on the Typhoon Danas, and please be on the watch. And back to you, Daniel and Geon-young.
Well, thanks, Bo-kyung, for that. Now, Typhoon Danas brought heavy rain, strong winds, and high tides to Korea's southernmost island of Jeju on this Tuesday, bringing damage along with it. The Jeju Regional Meteorological Administration says the island is now under the direct influence of the typhoon, and restrictions are in place on the island's roads, while ferry and flight services have been canceled.
Over 1,700 households experienced blackouts earlier in the day, and around 100 schools on Jeju have closed for the day. The Ministry of Security and Public Administration has placed public officials on emergency notice to prepare for and prevent further damage.
And the fast-approaching typhoon has led authorities to postpone the planned joint naval drills between South Korea, the United States, and Japan.
Our Kim Young-gil has more on this story.
With gusty winds of up to 45 meters per second, Typhoon Danas is making its way through the Korea Strait, a sea passage between Korea and Japan, moving at a speed of at least 30 kilometers per hour. It is expected to pass the southern part of Korea on Wednesday and move up to Japan before beginning to dissipate. With the typhoon fast approaching, a planned naval drill between South Korea, the United States, and Japan has been postponed. The trilateral drills were scheduled to take place from Tuesday to Thursday and were to involve search and rescue operations and other maritime maneuvers. The drills were to involve the nuclear-powered American aircraft carrier, the USS George Washington, a guided missile cruiser, and a guided missile destroyer from the US, as well as Aegis destroyers from South Korea and Japan. A South Korean senior Navy official speaking on the condition of anonymity said Tuesday that consultations are underway on whether to postpone the drills a few days or cancel them. The official added the George Washington has been moved to a safer place and is currently on standby. Kim Young-gil, Arirang News.
Now, the two-day APEC summit came to an end earlier on this Tuesday with the leaders adopting a joint declaration on promoting free trade and staying away from protectionist measures. The agreement falls in line with what President Park Geun-hye has been calling for during her stay in Bali. Arirang News Presidential Office correspondent Oh Jin-ju, traveling with the president, brought us this report before heading for Brunei.
The key focus of this year's APEC summit was strengthening the multilateral trading system with the goal of achieving balanced growth within the Asia-Pacific region. On the last day of the gathering in Bali on Tuesday, the leaders adopted a joint declaration and agreed to extend their commitment to resist protectionist measures by a year to 2016. President Park put great emphasis on trade liberalization throughout the two-day meeting. On Monday, in a keynote speech at the first session of the summit, the president has stressed that trade liberalization is the most cost-effective way to promote economic revitalization, job creation, and welfare enhancement. In an interview with Indonesian newspaper The Jakarta Post published on Tuesday, President Park reiterated that APEC member nations should strive to block the spread of trade protectionism. She said although countries may be tempted to engage in trade protectionism when the economy gets bad, history has shown that promoting trade at such times eventually leads to economic recovery. President Park's call for tangible outcomes at the 9th World Trade Organization ministerial meeting set to take place in December was also reflected in the leaders' declaration. The president in particular had called for progress in the stalled Doha development agenda, a current trade negotiation round of the WTO. In a separate effort to promote trade and investment on the sidelines of the summit, President Park had also sought ways to push ahead with FTA negotiations or further develop previously signed trade pacts during her bilateral talks with the leaders of China, Canada, Mexico, and Peru. President Park is expected to continue this push for trade liberalization in her bilateral summits with leaders of Brunei, Singapore, Australia, and Myanmar at the next destination of her Southeast Asian trip, Brunei, where she will be attending the Korea-ASEAN, ASEAN+3, and East Asia summits. Oh Jin-ju, Arirang News, Bali.
Any hope of a thawing of relations between Seoul and Tokyo looks to be dimming, with President Park Geun-hye and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe at pains to avoid bumping into each other at this week's APEC summit. Our foreign affairs correspondent Hwang Sang-hee reports on what's keeping the two countries' ties in the deep freeze.
In his column for Global Asia published last month, Korean Foreign Minister Yoon Byung-se suggested applying President Park Geun-hye's so-called trust politic at the regional level and transforming the existing structure of mistrust into one of trust and cooperation. Here, Minister Yoon is referring to Seoul and Tokyo's frosty relations. South Korea has been demanding Japan issue a formal apology for the war crimes it committed during its colonial rule of Korea, including the issue of Korean women forced into sexual slavery under the Japanese military. At his latest meeting with his Japanese counterpart Fumio Kishida last month in New York, the South Korean diplomat called on Tokyo to make stronger efforts to improve bilateral ties.
We hope to see a brave leadership by Japan to heal the wounds of the past.
The Japanese official, however, rejected the request, saying the Abe cabinet has followed the views of past governments on historical issues. The issue was addressed again by President Park Geun-hye during her meeting last week with U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel. President Park said the lack of trust between Seoul and Tokyo stemmed from the Japanese leadership's controversial remarks on historical and territorial issues. The leaders of South Korea and Japan have yet to sit down for a bilateral meeting under the Park administration. And with President Park and Prime Minister Abe refusing to make eye contact at Monday's APEC summit in Indonesia, it seems highly unlikely a bilateral summit will happen anytime soon. Hwang Sang-hee, Arirang News.
It was the main opposition's turn to lay out its priorities for the current parliamentary session on this Tuesday, following the ruling Henry Party's address a day earlier. Restoration of democracy and welfare of the general public topped the list for the Democratic Party. Our National Assembly correspondent Kim Hyun-ji reports.
At a gathering of the full parliament and members of President Park Geun-hye's cabinet Tuesday, Democratic Party floor leader Chun Byung-hun accused the Park administration of putting a dent in democracy and the welfare of the general public, the values the Constitution says the government must uphold. Calling the first 8 months of the Park administration an era of crippled governance, Chun said it all emanated from, quote, the spy agency's interference in last year's presidential election and President Park's refusal to acknowledge it. He argued the president has refused to communicate and work with the opposition and has turned a blind eye to the party's protests against the government and ruling party. Chun called for tough reforms of the National Intelligence Service, including limits on its investigative power, that would be led by the parliament.
The investigative power of the National Intelligence Service must be limited to information on North Korea, here and abroad. South Korea is the only advanced democratic nation where the intelligence agency has investigative authority.
Saying that President Park has taken a step back from many of the campaign pledges she made on economic democratization and welfare, the opposition party floor leader also vowed to push for fair business practices and universal welfare.
The Democratic Party will push for a paradigm shift to an economy where wages and consumption fuel growth, ending the old era of neoliberalism, where land development and speculation led growth.
Chun made clear that his party will oppose the government's attempt to revise the nation's tax code, saying that it is a scheme that places a heavier revenue burden on salaried workers and the self-employed, and asks very little from the wealthiest members of society. In response, the ruling Saenuri Party said the Democratic Party's claims about a democracy in retreat under the Park Geun-hye administration are nonsense, and that Korea's democracy is on par with some of the most advanced nations in the world. Kim Hyun-ji, Arirang News.
With rapid changes in the global economy, up-to-date business and financial news has never been more essential. See what's making markets tick around the globe. We speak to the experts and cover the biggest financial stories.
North Korea provocation.
Quite good. We received a lot of positive feedback, especially from those abroad.
Now, shifting our focus to the economy, Korea's finance ministry says the nation's economic recovery is picking up speed with some major indicators showing improvement. Arirang's economics correspondent Hwang Ji-hye has the details.
Data in this month's report by the Ministry of Strategy and Finance on the latest economic conditions in Korea is pointing to the strong prospects for a sustained recovery. The report says major economic indicators, including consumption, investment, and output, are showing signs of improvement amid stable employment and inflation figures. Korea's industrial output grew 1.8% in August from a month ago, the fastest pace in 9 months on strong automobile and mobile phone production. There were more than 25 million people at work in August, up more than 430,000 from a year earlier, the largest on-year job growth in 11 months. The finance ministry warned, however, that weak private sector activity could have a negative impact on the economy. While Korea, like many other emerging nations, faces external risks, particularly from the U.S. Federal Reserve's planned tapering of its bond-buying stimulus program, the International Monetary Fund said Tuesday that Korea is among the countries that will likely fare the best. The IMF said Korea, along with Canada and Australia, have strong economic fundamentals, citing their high currency reserves and low reliance on foreign funding. The agency said it measured a country's ability to withstand major capital outflows, which is expected to happen when the Federal Reserve starts scaling back its $85 billion monthly asset purchases. Hwang Ji-hye, Arirang News.
Well, business was booming for Korean shipbuilders in the first 9 months of the year. Data from the London-based Clarkson Research Services shows that the combined orders for Korean ship contracts rose 88.7% in the first 3 quarters of the year compared to the same period a year earlier. Domestic shipbuilders won a combined 10.8 million compensated gross tons of new orders in that time frame, good enough for 36% of orders worldwide. And while that's a positive development for the sector, which has been struggling through the economic downturn and slowing demand, industry watchers were quick to tamp down expectations of a full-blown recovery as new shipbuilding prices will still remain low compared to 2 years ago.
The U.S. government shutdown enters week 2. U.S. President Barack Obama says he's willing to talk with Republican leaders, but not under the threat of a debt default and a prolonged government shutdown. Our Kim Min-ji has the latest.
With the U.S. government shutdown extending into its second week and the debt limit deadline looming, U.S. President Barack Obama on Monday called on Republican leaders to hold a vote to reopen the government and raise the debt ceiling.
The truth of the matter is there are enough Republican and Democratic votes in the House of Representatives right now to end the shutdown immediately, with no partisan strings attached.
The president was responding to a statement by House Representative Speaker John Boehner on Sunday, who claimed that there are not enough votes to pass a resolution to end the shutdown. Boehner said, however, that he is willing to talk with the president about the issue of raising the debt ceiling, which currently sits at $16.7 trillion. Lawmakers have until October 17th to increase the nation's multi-trillion-dollar debt ceiling to pay its bills and avoid default. Obama said he is willing to talk to Republicans on fiscal and budget issues, but not under threat of a shutdown and debt default. Separately, on Monday, White House National Economic Council Director Dean Sperling did not rule out a short-term increase to the borrowing cap, which could offer more time for an agreement. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
That said,
Now, early last month, a symbolic marriage of a gay Korean film director and his longtime partner made the headlines. The couple held a huge public ceremony and exchanged vows in downtown Seoul.
Same-sex marriage. How close is Korea to recognize the union of homosexuals in both legal and moral terms? Joining us live in the studio to discuss the issue is Todd Henry, Assistant Professor of History at the University of California, San Diego.
Professor Henry, welcome to the program.
Good evening.
Now, first of all, same-sex marriage is a hotly contested issue all across the globe. So before we head into our discussion on Korea, let's first talk about the global trend on the issue. I mean, just a few months ago in the U.S., there was a Supreme Court ruling saying that the federal government must recognize same-sex marriages from states that allow them. And then a few weeks before that, there was a French city recognizing and witnessing history when its mayor officiated the nation's first same-sex wedding in front of hundreds of guests. So how is the global trend changing regarding the issue?
Well, if you look at the issue historically, as I do, I would say that it is changing. At the turn of the century, in 2000, there was no country in the world that recognized same-sex marriage. 13 years later, we have 15 countries that recognize and have legalized same-sex marriage, most of them in Northern Europe, but they also include countries in otherwise conservative places, Catholic-dominated places in Latin America, one country in Africa. Just this year, New Zealand is the first Asia-Pacific country to recognize same-sex marriage. So certainly we have a long way to go, but I think the trend is moving in that direction.
Okay, well, it's been around for as long as maybe even time. Well, there aren't many countries, though, that give legal recognition to same-sex couples. Of course, Korea, among one of the most strongly against same-sex marriage at the moment. I believe we still have a lot of work to do. Conservative Asian countries, namely, when it comes to homosexuality and gay marriages, they're not willing to make it legal at the moment. Perhaps is it too early to even think about legalizing that in Korea or in other parts of Asia?
Well, I think Korea is a conservative country, but perhaps no more conservative than other Asian countries, and certainly less so than many countries in Africa, which criminalize same-sex relations. But I think the main obstacle in this regard is the historically entrenched system of patriarchy, which requires people to get married and have children and pass on the family line. So this is probably one of the most substantial obstacles to same-sex marriage. On the other hand, though, I would say that Korean society is increasingly open to this issue. The fact that we're even sitting here and having this conversation today suggests something about the way that the direction that Korea is moving in. We see themes relating to gay and lesbian people on television, in dramas. We have human rights organizations, civil society that hopefully will be at least willing to talk about the issue, if not embrace the kind of legal battles that probably are awaiting us.
So right now we're slightly above average in terms of the median range in Asia. We are certainly perhaps not giving the legal consent for it, but we are not punishing this behavior, so it's good.
That's right. And, I think the world is now watching to see which Asian country will be the first to sanction same-sex marriage. We've seen it in Europe, we've seen it in North America, we've seen it in Latin America, and as I mentioned, in Africa. So Asia is the next region, I think, that's going to experience some significant change.
So development in this field could actually be used as a litmus test or a gauge to measure how much further ahead Korea is in terms of certain elements of progress around the world.
That could be. That could very well be. Just as governments like to take claim for global cities, green cities, technologically advanced societies, same-sex marriage may, in fact, over time become one of those kinds of issues.
Now let's go back to last month's public wedding between a Korean gay film director and his partner. Kim Jo-kwang-soo has said that he will apply or formally apply to get his marriage with his partner legally registered, and if denied, he's willing to take legal action. Now, what are some key changes that need to take place here in Korea in the legal realm and the Korean society in order for same-sex marriages to become legal? I mean, right now it's not legal, nor is it illegal, because it's just not recognized.
That's right. So, if you think about it, legality does not exist in a vacuum. It's made by humans, and so it's open to debate and it's open to change. And so in the future, this will be debated by the people, the Korean people, their politicians and their court systems about how they want to proceed. Now, you're quite right in saying that same-sex marriage, technically speaking, is not illegal in South Korea, as it is in some United States states. And this is something actually that may happen in the future as certain individuals seek legal recognition of their marriage. We may see politicians who come out and pass bills that make a same-sex marriage illegal. But the main problem in this regard, I think, is the registration system. So even if Kim Jo-kwang-soo has a wedding ceremony, he tries to register it with the local court office, and the local court office has to accept that application. And this has been the point where same-sex marriage has been rejected in the past decade. We're going to have to see how the court systems responds to this recent application, but I would predict that we're going to see some protracted struggles in the court system to figure out how this is going to develop.
Well, even in that historic wedding, there were hundreds of people there. I believe some of them were interested, some of them were supportive, some of them were just passing by. But there was one particular individual from a certain religious belief who was calling it blasphemy and even started pouring garbage on the occasion and was, of course, arrested. But legal is another factor. Legal grounds, even if it's made to make sure gay marriage is approved, we're bound to see some great shock and opposition in a very conservative society like Korea, and also from the religious groups and religious elements. I mean, there are a lot of religious beliefs that more or less label homosexuality as a sin. So do you think Korea will be able to, or the Korean people and the public will be able to go beyond that and embrace homosexuality someday soon?
I think you're right. I mean, I think there will be detractors of a conservative bent politically and religious groups who will oppose this, and quite strongly, as has been the case elsewhere in the world. You know, I'm from the United States and I'm a resident of the state of California. And very recently we've had a similar experience where the people of California in 2008 passed a referendum outlawing same-sex marriage. It took 5 years of struggle before that was repealed. So, you know, in that sense, I think Korea is not so different from other places in the world. You're going to see struggles. You're also going to see, and I think we're already seeing this, a generational difference in those who accept this issue and those who reject it. So according to one recent poll, as many as 35% of Koreans are in favor of same-sex marriage. But if you break that down in terms of generation, you find out that, you know, almost 3/4 of the population over 50 years of age oppose this issue, whereas individuals in their 20s and early 30s seem to be on the majority side. So you're going to see those kinds of generational issues that are going to also explain how things develop. I mean, the other thing I should say is that, you know, this is by far not the first same-sex marriage that Korea has experienced. I've been studying this issue and have been finding some documents that show that as early as the 1960s, women of the same sex, not legally but symbolically, were getting married. These materials were published in Korean publications, they were sold, and so you know, I think there is a history to same-sex marriage that Koreans should know about, and that dates back to this earlier period.
All right, well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. I would like to see you in the near future to continue our discussion on this issue. Todd Henry, Professor of History at the University of California, San Diego, thank you so much for speaking with us this evening.
Thank you.
And we have this breaking news coming in that South Korea's National Intelligence Service confirming that the North has restarted its nuclear reactor at Yongbyon, that it has been restarted, and the National Intelligence Service told lawmakers earlier today. And we'll have more on that in a later newscast.
That's all from us for this hour. Thank you for watching.